Well, a new night for the insiders, so for new viewers, an explanation of what it is they try to do here. The commitment is to check their partisanship at the door in an effort to help Canadians understand the inner workings of the country's politics. Jamie Watt has held key positions in a number of Conservative Party campaigns, ditto for Kathleen Monk in the NDP and for David Hurley with the Liberals. So we're roughly a year away from the promised election. October 19th in 2015 is the fixed date election, which begs the question, is a fixed date a fixed date? Jamie.
I think this time it is a fixed date because we'll remember that the fixed date was brought in by Prime Minister Harper. He broke that once and had an explanation for doing that. But you know, Peter, Conservatives like rules and they like people that follow rules. So I think it is a fixed date. I think there's almost no chance it's getting moved. You know,
just before Kathleen and David weigh in on this, it's important to note that in much of the country now, fixed date elections are the way of the land. Look at this map of Canada, and if you see those areas that are in red, two territories, Yukon and Nunavut, and Nova Scotia are the only places left in the country where there is not a fixed date election. Kathleen, is this fixed for sure for next fall?
I think we have really moved into the era of permanent campaigning, so it doesn't really matter. I think the bigger challenge that's facing Canadians in our democracy is the fact that there are rules around now 36 days of an election cycle, but there's another 1,500 days that aren't regulated. So we have this kind of wild, wild west of political spending that's now happening since May 2nd, 2011 to theoretically mid-September when the writ will be dropped in 2015 if they stick to that date. And I think that's a problem. Our rules need to catch up with fixed election dates.
David, do you think there's a risk that the fixed date will be ignored?
Well, I think there's always a risk when political considerations are involved. I mean, this was put into place to eliminate some of the finagling that prime ministers could do or premiers could do about election timing to suit their own advantage rather than the democracy's advantage, I guess, if you will. But the truth of the matter is that I find it hard to believe that people are going to march willingly into certain defeat. And this is what this brings up, is parties have always put off elections if it looked like they were going to lose. Lots of governments, Pierre Trudeau's, Brian Mulroney's, went into their 5th year trying to search for a magic way to win re-election. Didn't call on the anniversary of their election on the 4th year because they would have lost at that point in time. And so this is going to put parties in a conundrum where they say, well, I guess we're supposed to call the election in 4 months, but it looks certain that we will lose that election. And in that case, changing the date will be considered. I don't know whether it will be done, but it will be considered.
Some provinces are concerned about the possibility of the election next fall, the likelihood of it, because it conflicts with their own. Look at this chart with at least 3 provinces where elections are scheduled for next fall: PEI, Northwest Territories, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, which raises the issue of, you know, is it too hard for party workers to be working on 2 campaigns at roughly the same time?
Well, first of all, I think fixed election dates are crazy. It was one of the few prerogatives a prime minister or leader had, and I'm sure they're sitting around that table, David, and they're saying, who the hell ever thought up this idea? We got the votes of 7 political science professors, and now look at the big mess that we're in, right? So I think it is a crazy idea. I don't even think it fits with our parliamentary democracy. But it does tax workers, especially now when we don't have enough workers to run any campaign. You know, the days of massive armies of volunteers are over. So when you duplicate it against those other campaigns, it's a problem.
Are there consequences?
There really aren't. I mean, we saw in 2008 and 2011 they didn't stick to the rules that were set, and there was no consequence for Harper. Really, after the writs dropped, the flurry of news that comes out in the rush of the election, it all gets drowned out, and there's very few consequences.
Little different there because of minority, but...
And I think that's a bigger factor. A minority or majority parliament, the stability of the parliament. I mean, Chrétien famously used, the thing is that being able to call an election is such a strategic advantage for the government, right? When Chrétien found the perfect conditions in 2000 and called the election so he could get another victory. And I think that's what Harper was trying to move against when he brought in the law in 2007.
I was just going to say, I think it's a lot riskier when you try to extend your mandate and therefore be seen, if you're an unpopular government and you're pushing off fixed election date or no fixed election date, it looks like you're evading accountability. So pushing it longer is always riskier than going early.
Yeah.
Okay, you know, Jamie, you tweeted yesterday that we were going to talk about this, and I love the reaction your tweet got from a viewer out there who hopefully is watching tonight. Here it is. It's Dr. Raymond McConville. He says, fixed dates Americanize and devalue the parliamentary system.
He's a smart guy. He's right. I mean, it doesn't even fit. The whole point of our parliamentary system is the governing party has to meet the test of the House every day. Now, we have some rules so that we have stability and so on, but if the government can't carry the confidence of the House, they get defeated. Then they go to the Governor General and they either call an election or give the other side a chance. So it really is an idea. It's our fetish for the Americanization of our system, where we bring these ideas in from the States and we try and make them fit a system they weren't designed for.
But that's the key, is the confidence in the government. And that's why minority governments we saw from 2006 through to 2011, we were constantly in the ready position, always. We prepared for possible elections in 2007 and 2009. That meant, you know, hiring planes and getting buses wrapped and ready to go. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on contracts for planes that never got off the air because we had to be ready as a party in case that writ was dropped.
Well, I'm assuming all three parties are getting ready, fixated on October 19th of next year. So I want to talk a little bit about that, about what happens this far out, a little more than a year out from that October 19th date. What are parties doing? What data, I know always there's an argument about that word, but what's being collected, David?
All sorts of things that people have no idea about. Big data and the use of big data is the biggest change in politics in the last decade, as far as I'm concerned. Previous campaigns I ran, it was barely a factor, and now it is an enormous factor. All the parties have very sophisticated software programs that allow them to absorb all kinds of different information about voters and use that to target fundraising appeals, use that to target messaging, use that to even target your door-to-door knocking in an election campaign so that you're not wasting time talking to people. But whether it's the magazines...
So they're not really even door-to-door anymore.
It's not door-to-door. It's going after the slice of people that are potential for you. And they will take all kinds of data from what you've ever said or done publicly to your voting record to the magazines you subscribe to, build a demographic and psychographic profile around you and say, I rate that person on a 7 to 9 likely to vote Liberal. That person will knock on their door. That person's a 1 to 3 to vote Liberal. No, we'll never talk to them again.
You know, I see why they're doing that, but is that good for the system?
Well, I think David has a point. They're doing more of it. But, you know, there's a professor at Duke called Dan Early, and he talks about big data like teenage sex. You know, everybody thinks about it. Everyone talks about it. No one has any idea how to do it because you think everyone else is doing it. You claim that you're doing it yourself. And if you look at big data and its use in the consumer world and you compare it to its use in the political
this guy's classes?
In the political world, I think they're light years behind, and I think David only dreams about the real applications of big data, which are yet to come. Talking about it, but we haven't figured out how to do it yet.
Where are you on big data, Kathleen?
Staying away from that, but I think I agree with some of what David said, and I also disagree. I think that, you know, one thing that's clear is you can't run the 2015 election on 2011 data or data, and that's why, because the political landscape has really changed. In fact, we know the ridings are changing in this next election. There's 30 new seats, and we have a couple dozen candidates that are not representing, so there's no incumbent in those seats. So there's a lot of changes going to happen for 2015, and so there's migration of electors, so parties are tracking that. Where are these electors moving? What are their new polls? In fact, the poll information is only going to come down from Elections Canada sometime in November. But I disagree with David on the point that we are still doing door-to-door knocking, and that's still one of the most effective ways is to convert and persuade voters. I agree with him that it has to be more efficient, so we do target more specifically people who are more likely to vote and who are more likely to support your party. So it's more streamlined. But we collect all sorts of data on them, like Kathleen Monk. She lives at X address. She, you know, makes X amount of money. She's taken a sign before and donated before.
But are you saying that you don't have the access to the kind of information he's talking about, or you do, and nevertheless you'll still go door-to-door?
We definitely have the same information. So everyone uses the Canadian electors list, which is around 20 million Canadians. From that, you create a profile using things like David talked about, like the consumer data that you can overlay, demographic data from StatsCan that you can buy and purchase. You can purchase phone numbers. You do all this, but
you got to have the central organization to take all this.
Yeah, and every party has
together.
very sophisticated databases. And what we're trying to do, like David said, is create a profile, a demographic profile of a voter who would support your party. And then you target those people, or you try to recruit people.
You want to defend your thesis now, or do you just want to attack Jamie's
I think Jamie's being incredibly... I actually think Kathleen ultimately came around to my position, and I think that Jamie's being excessively modest, because everybody knows that the Conservatives pioneered the use of big data in Canadian election campaigns, and their SIMS database remains the gold standard in that regard.
We certainly agree with Paul Wells. You know, Paul Wells famously says the plural of anecdote isn't data. Right? And once you understand that, you actually understand the importance of building these data profiles on voters.
Paul Wells, the great writer for the Maclean's magazine, and the author of the last year's award-winning book on Stephen Harper. So tell me something else that they're doing a year out from here, other than going through all that. Kathleen?
Well, all sorts of things. They're looking at, they're in acquisition mode right now. And so that's where I make the point that door knocking is happening. So they're having things like days of action, you know, where they actually not only send out petitions or invite people through email or fundraising lists, but they're actually door knocking on people to get voters engaged so they can get their information. They can find out, oh, Peter lives at this address and he's leaning X, Y, and Z party. So they're really in the acquisition, and then they move to analysis. So you can use those 35 days or 36 days of the election just to really focus on getting out the vote.
Jamie?
Well, of course, it depends if you're in the opposition or if you're in the government, because one of the things, if you're in government and you know you have a fixed election date, you're making a list of things that you've got to get tidied up or you have to get dealt with so that they're not causing you an election problem. So you're not only preparing as a party, but you're also preparing as a government to make sure there aren't any surprises during that campaign.
One more thing, David.
I think there's a gray area here that Canadians should think about a little bit, which is the dual role of members of parliament as representatives of their constituency and of members of a political party. And I think that probably some more attention ought to be paid to how information about individuals that comes into a member of parliament's office then gets used ultimately politically, whether they asked for help on an immigration case or whether they needed help with an EI problem or whether they express some point of view about a policy issue. I think it's really important to keep those roles and responsibilities dead separate.
All right. You raise a very interesting topic of discussion, which I'm sure we'll have at some other point. Thank you all. First Monday night for Jamie, David, and Kathleen. Well, we'll concentrate on a number of other areas of election readiness in future editions of The Insiders. Jamie, Kathleen, and David will be back in 2 weeks.